and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. It is my great pleasure to welcome Deepa Prahalad, an accomplished author, design and innovation consultant with extensive experience working with both startups and large multinational organizations as our esteemed guest on today's episode. Deepa is the co-author of Predictable Magic, a book recognized by Fast Company as one of the best design books of the year. In addition to her consulting work, Deepa is a frequent contributor to respected platforms such as the Huffington Post, Harvard Business Review, and various other magazines, where she shares insights on innovation and design strategy. She is also an internationally sought after speaker and mentor, particularly for social entrepreneurs, guiding them on how to integrate design thinking into business models for greater impact. A passionate art enthusiast, Deepa engages in crafting, collecting, and community-driven projects. She serves on multiple global non-profit boards and has generously volunteered her expertise in design and public speaking for cultural events, including the Festival of Dolls, Beyond Bollywood, and other community gatherings. She also led the design for the House of India, a newly opened museum in San Diego, historic Balboa Park, the largest urban park in the United States. Deepa holds a BA in Economics and Political Science from the University of Michigan, as well as MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. In this episode, Deepa will offer valuable insights from her highly acclaimed book, Predictable Magic: Unleash the Power of Design Strategy to Transform Your Business. Kicking off this conversation, let's warmly welcome Deepa Prahalad to the show. It's a real privilege to welcome you, Deepa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Deepak. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know it's quite late for you in India, so I appreciate your accommodating all the time zones.
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. Deepa, you and Ravi Sawhney introduced a concept called psychoaesthetics in your book. Can you explain what this term means and how it helps create emotional connections between consumers and brands?
So let me just go back to the beginning. So psychoaesthetics is both a term and a process that we really describe in our book. When I first met Ravi, he had been working with this process in his firm, RKS Design, for a number of years. And the core premise of psychoaesthetics is just a term that means we are looking at the emotional response to design. That's what we're trying to measure and evaluate in terms of understanding how do we innovate, what are our chances of reaching the consumer in the desired way, both in the physical design as well as, the narrative around whatever it is that we create. I think what we really have is a fairly simple core premise that so many new things, everybody is very intrigued and invested in this idea of innovation. And yet you see that there's so many things that fail to hit the mark. And our hypothesis was simply like what really spells out the difference between products that succeed and those that don't is their ability to forge an emotional connection with their audience. And while that insight sounds simple, it's quite difficult when you are starting something new and consumers don't necessarily have a reference, right? You're not trying to do a small tweak to something that exists, which may be easier to explain. So I think that was something that was important to us. And we realized that, big companies, the investments, the amount of time, energy, and talent that goes into these to have them fail as quickly as they sometimes do is huge. But big companies may be able to survive that. At the same time, you saw this huge uptick in people interested in startups, and they can't survive that, right? I mean, I think that design is that make or break thing for every entrepreneur. I always tell people, that's the difference between people telling you you have a good idea and placing an order. So that connection is especially valuable when you're just starting.
Very insightful. You mentioned that 80% of new products fail or underperform. What do you think most companies are missing in their approach to product strategy that leads to these high failure rates?
I mean, to be fair, I think that it's always discussed. We're just living in this increasingly complex, unpredictable world. So I think some of these challenges we come to fairly. The other issue is that today, even a startup is designing for global markets. So I suddenly have to take into account this huge variety of tastes, of preferences, habits, infrastructure, all of these, and huge amounts of competition. And even when I do get it right, even if I'm an Apple, right? I mean, they had to sue within a year because people were able to copy even the best designs. Um, so I think we have this smaller and shrinking window of opportunity, even for really good products and services before it's co-opted or copied, in some significant ways by others. And you also, I think the other issue that makes these things quite complicated is that business is now being asked to weigh in on issues they were never asked to before. So it's huge, thrust for sustainability, to talk about equality, inclusion, all of these things. So it's no longer, is the product safe? Do I like it? Can I afford it? Both, companies have to really create meaning for their consumers, and consumers are also applying a lot of filters that they didn't historically apply. So that said, things have become more complex, but I think the flip side of that is it really highlights the precise reasons why design is so important. Design is really at its heart a way of synthesizing all of these different forces and still creating something that's aspirational. And I think also the importance of visual tools is super important to cut through all that clutter, right? I mean, we can't, how many reports can a person process? So having simple ways to visualize the information and in the innovation process is incredibly important. But the finished product of design also, when people see it, hey, this isn't a perfect solution, but this has inspired me. So today, design isn't like this final answer, right? It's really an invitation to collaborators to build community, to keep the process moving forward. And I think that's where we can actually reduce failure rates quite significantly by understanding how to integrate some of these things more effectively and efficiently.
Because many people view the success of certain products as magic. In your book, you explain that it's not magic, but a well thought out design strategy. What makes this strategy predictable and repeatable?
Well, we can make the process predictable and repeatable. The results we cannot we can't completely guarantee. And design, I mean, to be fair, design alone um, needs to work in tandem with the consumer experience, distribution, logistics, marketing, all of these other things in order to deliver value in the right way. But I think one of the most important things is people have tended to think about innovation and creativity and become very fixated on the ideation stage. The visual that's always created about design is, wow, I have this entire wall that's littered with sketches and post-it notes, and this just shows what a genius I am. But really, what enables both individuals and organizations to move forward is clarity. Having kind of a really clear understanding about what your point of view is, what the impact you're attempting to have is. And I think that what we really tried to do was say, can we focus on some core questions? You know, how is the industry changing? How are consumers evolving? And what are the emerging opportunities? If we can take the information that we have at hand and map that and understand those three questions, that's enough. And the direction, not 100% there, but establishing that direction will allow people to suddenly like move forward and create in a more systematic um, manner. And I think that's one of those really, however complex issues, that's almost demands that you go back to fundamentals and basics that people can understand, and then again zoom out and really see what's missing, having done that. So I think the most important thing we can do is reduce the pain of getting started, because sometimes, depending on the industry, there and the other last thing is the magic really comes from creating a really tight and good match and self-reinforcing both the design and the story. That's how you build trust, and it's a very complex undertaking because a lot of times, especially in social change or whatever, you're trying to deal with kind of complex or uncomfortable issues, and yet you still have to create something that's aspirational. Um, so I think this is where design and story need to be very carefully integrated, and that's where I think the magic truly lies.
You discussed the importance of integrating corporate strategy with design. How do you see the role of design evolving in today's business world, especially with the rise of digital products and services?
Yeah, I think that today they're much more carefully integrated for a few reasons. Number one, I mean, the IT revolution changed things so significantly where even a startup founder, for example, they can get 80% precision on a lot of the demographic information, the income information, consumer habits. So privileged information alone doesn't give you this huge advantage that it once did. And a lot of companies are talking about similar things, whether it's AI, whether it's sustainability. So it's really become now more not a question of what you know, but how you put it all together. So design has kind of come to the forefront. Like nobody is waiting with bated breath to listen to your, download your mission statement, but they will actually look to see what you're producing, what kind of commitments you're making. And I think that's what people really look to design for it. It's not really just about aesthetics and packaging and all of the things we traditionally think about as design. I think design is really evidence of execution capability, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to say. Like, if somebody has made a commitment to, well, we're going to do this carbon target in 20, by this date, we have a good idea. Like, well, I actually trust, this set of people to do that based on what they are doing today. So that design is really your calling card, and I think people like Roger Martin and others who are big thinkers in the field really rightly said, like in the future, strategists won't have to understand designers better. They will have to become designers because now it's really this continuum of, sure, I have clarity on what needs to be done, but it's probably not something that has been done before, right? I need to also be able to execute in a very interesting way. And often today, given the challenges we have, they're not really going to be able to execute just by working within their own firm, right? You have to work with outside organizations, with NGOs, with government to deliver on safety, sustainability, education, all of these massive challenges we have. So I think that's where the strategy part is really important. And the digital world has changed a few really big things. One is that, for a lot of new technologies, there is both this panic and excitement. And the cost barrier for a chat GPT or a lot of these exciting new things, that's not an issue. Where I have to design the narrative now is different. I have to help explain what my motivations are. What's under the hood is now sometimes as or more important than what's on the shelf. What's on the shelf mean so the trust and where I have to have the conversation has really changed. So that's, another way that the digital world is there. But people also now pre-buying are using so many digital channels to learn, and then that feedback loop continues long after purchase. People now form their own communities, or when they're excited about something, they'll learn about it, talk about how they ordered it. Oh, it's come in. I'm going to unbox it now in front of everybody. And so there's a lot more touch points that have to be managed. And I think that's a huge opportunity, but it does make things far more complex. So there's nobody who can not have a very, very well-crafted digital piece, no matter how small they are.
One of the themes in the book is about crafting not just useful products, but empowering experiences. Could you give us an example of a company that has mastered this and what we can learn from this approach?
I think there's so many companies that actually do this in different ways, right? I think if you look at a company like Lego, from the earliest stages. Lego magazine, they're engaging kids, they're helping them not just play, but helping them share their creations, helping them build confidence. And you see now that like the people that Lego is designing for are not in a certain age demographic. There are quite a few of their products and services that are actually geared toward adult enthusiasts who are motivated by nostalgia, who are still deeply moved by that idea of creativity and expressing themselves. Um, and so, like now, Lego is a place where they have a lot of things that reflect pop culture as much as they reflect childhood imagination. So, anything can be made empowering. If I look at even something so simple like a basic crayon that Crayola made, what you really see is when I was growing up, flesh tone was one color, right? And I don't think I ever had any deep objections or insight about that. But as a company, they basically said, well, wait a minute, that doesn't reflect the world we live in. Why don't we have eight skin shades and more than that? To reflect when I'm drawing people, I can now draw somebody that looks closer to me. The other thing they've done is said, okay, at a certain age, you can use a crayon. Let's go deeper. So they have like an egg-shaped crayon where now even a small, one-year old can grab it in their hand and begin to see something that they've done. And then they have triangle ones for when you're a little bit older, but not really ready to hold a pencil. So I think that whole idea of empowering people, making them feel good about themselves, fundamentally, that's what all great design does is it's not about just what you feel about the design. It has to give you some sense of agency or fulfillment. Um, and that's what we talk about when we're talking about emotional connection. And no brand does there's a few emotions that really drive value. It's not an exhaustive list, right? So there are things that are duty, things that give us our feeling about justice. So there's some inherent, contradictions there. We all want empowerment. I want to have dessert, but I want it to be somewhat healthy or healthier, right? So I think that people really who navigate those contradictions very well and explain this is the solution that we came up with and why in an engaging way are the ones who are able to really craft these empowering experiences that drive value long term.
Very insightful. Thank you. Deepa, what role do emotions play in consumer decision making? And how can businesses systematically design products that resonate with consumers on this emotional level?
Yeah, I think that is a question that is, it's not a one-time effort because really when you're introducing something new, there's a lot of heavy lifting that goes into showing how it was created, what you're trying to achieve, how this is going to benefit my life. I mean, what is kind of the starting point is I have to believe that this purchase is somehow going to make my life better. That's the first threshold, right? Is it going to make me save time, cook better? What are the benefits? They're there, but I think the really interesting thing is even for established companies, for startups, you have to make sure that you are able to engage in this long-term conversation because emotional connection is always important, but the basis of that connection can change. And I think if you use the metaphor of like, our friendships or our family relationships, I mean, as a parent, you evolve from being this caregiver who's delivering guidance and advice. Later, you're more just a support system as people become more independent. So I think that a lot of our relationships with products are similar, right? I mean, at first, people are saying, okay, I'm going to get onto the internet so I can buy. Now it's like this research tool. It's a way for me to express myself. So, what we use things for and the relationships we have, even with our devices, all the products we use, really can evolve and change over time. And good companies, all they do is really kind of track that and understand what that means, how they can respond, and how they can can help you. And I think that also just creating that sense of familiarity and novelty is the sweet spot in terms of emotional connection, right? I mean, you have to do, like, even if you talk about cars, right? We still talk about them in terms of horsepower. Why is, look at how far back that transition happened. And yet, um, that's the same thing. But I think ultimately, there are these a few companies and startups and others. It's increasingly user created value, right? The company is in some sense providing the prompt. And what you really see in top performing companies is they're the ones who are able to do things like co-create with their customers. I mean, that is a very tangible evidence that people are deeply invested and interested in what you are doing, and they're trying to help you make it better. And in some sense, that emotional connection has traditionally always been thought of at the point of purchase. What I have come to believe is that sometimes people understanding your story and what you're trying to do is even more important when something doesn't work out, right? I mean, when some companies, their app doesn't work or it fails, some of them die. Some of them have lots of programmers working around the clock to help them find a fix. There are some times that, people, oh, I found a product flaw, but I'm not angry. I'm trying to tell you so that you can now correct it and make sure that this doesn't happen and that we can continue to interact with this brand. So how you design recourse also has a very profound effect on people's emotional response because howsoever much you try, there are going to be those occasions when things don't work as planned. And that relationship and that emotional connection is usually what helps companies get back in the ring and come up with an appropriate response and get a second chance.
In the book, you mentioned several case studies from companies like Sprint, Medtronics, and Hyundai. Can you share one of the most impactful examples of psychoaesthetics in action and how it led to success?
Well, I think, Medtronic is probably the most dramatic example that we had when there was a mini med where we talked to, a lot of the brand leaders, and there was a company called mini med infusion that was doing a insulin pump. And this was before my time with our Ravi and RKS, but it's a really fascinating story where they said, this pump worked exceptionally well. And what they found is when they're trying to put it from the hospital setting into the consumer market, it just didn't really have the impact that was expected. And what ended up happening was the designers said, well, functionally, this is actually a really great product. It's pretty easy to use and pretty easy to read. And what they realized was that wearing it with this like hospital looking exterior really stigmatized whoever was wearing it, right? It was very visible as a medical device. So this is a particular case where actually just changing the aesthetics changed everything. Actually, it was refashioned to look like a pager, which was very cool at the time. And, it was made so it just kind of disappeared into the background, but you could keep track and know it was working. So then it was, I belong. I'm not a patient when I go out, when I have dinner, when I'm meeting with colleagues. And that simple change and that insight led to this huge boost in sales and adoption. And that company was later, MiniMed was acquired by Medtronic for like almost $4 billion. So that's an example from our book. But I think since then, there are so many examples where they may or may not have used psychoaesthetics explicitly, but the type of interaction and the type of strategy is very much in keeping with what we are advocating. So Hyundai, for example, when they released their first car in the United States, I mean, it was $5,000. And the nicest review that they got was somebody said it might be, in some cases, an acceptable alternative to a used car. But, what did they do to counter that hesitation? They had this very low price, but they also had the best warranty in the market, better than some established brands. But still, I mean, most of the people who took a chance were students, people with very limited means, but they kept that conversation going over time and they introduced a lot of models as people evolved, as they got married, had children, became more established professionally. They tracked the needs of a lot of people, but it was many years before they introduced a bigger sedan and an SUV. Now, in the 20th, 2008 financial crisis, I mean, car sales were at a standstill. And most companies dealt with that by offering cash incentives or large rebates. And they actually created a program called Hyundai Assurance, which basically said if you lose your job unexpectedly, we will take the car back without reporting to credit agencies. So what they did was not talk about features and not talk about fuel efficiency. They head on address the anxiety of a buyer saying, I actually need a car to get to work, or I need to replace a car, but I can't take that risk right now. They de-risked that purchase decision and they very quickly became, a top brand that year, surpassing a lot of established rivals because suddenly this was like, oh, I need to consider this brand. And they had done the homework of appropriate features. And then they later came out with the luxury, Equus car where the owner's manual was on an iPad and did a lot of other things. But I think this really highlights the idea that, the emotional connection really, that's not a single brand story. If you look at how countries like South Korea, when they've really thought about design at an advantage, even at the national level, there are so many companies today where, like South Korea was so poor in the 60s, they couldn't get country loans, right? And now you have K-pop, you have K-beauty, you have all of these things. So that combination of strategy and really articulating, what you stand for, certain type of aesthetic has a tremendous impact on individual companies and countries as well.
What is the role of narrative and storytelling in bringing a design to market?
Yeah, the narrative is super important because to some extent, aesthetics will always be subjective, right? People also bond with different products and services, are motivated to try based on the story itself. So if you look at something like Tom's shoes, those are fairly simple, most of their models, right? So I may or may not be blown away by the design of Tom's shoes. Now, when I hear the narrative that, oh, this is a buy one, get one, I'm actually in some small way making the world a better place. I'm relating to the mission. Suddenly that becomes a good I consider, right? I mean, I could find a similar style elsewhere. And I am more motivated to share that story, whether or not I make the purchase. So that can be the value of narrative, right? And even big companies have to be very clear. They assume that, I people know who I am. They've interacted with me all the time. But look at a company like Google. When they first came out with Google Glass, everyone was kind of intrigued, but they never really explained like what are we trying to do with this? And very quickly, people who signed up to experiment with this got creeped out, saying, wow, there are people walking around with this and recording everything. And why are I don't know who's eavesdropping. I don't know who's taking pictures of me without my consent. And a lot of the early testers ultimately, even by journalists, got labeled as glass holes. And, they finally really had to scale back the program. So I think that having this really tightly self-reinforcing idea, set of design and story. That's how you build trust. If I know that this is what I'm getting, um, and that's really, I think aligning those is really kind of a process of promise made and promise delivered, right? If I was expecting a home cooked meal and somebody gives me a beautiful plate of food with, all of these trimmings, it may objectively taste good, but I feel like I didn't get what I was expecting. And I think that that mismatch accounts for a lot of design failures, a lot of hesitation, a lot of mistrust. So, from the beginning with, Steve Jobs having the computer say hello to you when, computing was just starting to now where people have to find a way to create comfort and familiarity as they're introducing something new. That is really kind of the power of narrative.
Deepa, what is the connection between design and social change? Can you share some examples?
Yeah, I think that really design is about helping people cope with change, not just describing it. Like I think this really gets back to our point that so many changes can be felt before they can be precisely measured, right? So we think we all, for example, know that there's a lot more divorced couples. There's a lot more couple families where both parents are working. There's a co-parenting culture in place. All of those things are known. And, sometimes what we can really do with a lot of deep analysis is get more precision on something that we're already observing. But I think what design does is they'll say, let's go 10 levels deep. What does that mean? Oh, that means I need to put the diaper change facility in the men's bathroom as well. What if somebody's out with his children and wants to help them and maybe is able to do this easily at home? So I think that all of the social change challenges are quite interesting because you have to do that same level of work, and maybe the bar is even higher because people have fewer resources, fewer choices, and they're also less likely to be vocal about the missteps, right? I mean, I think people who are privileged naturally tend to be very vocal. I paid good money for this, and then they're very upfront. Whereas a lot of people from marginalized communities are not as vocal. So that need to be really holding ourselves to high standards, creating respect, and creating pathways to opportunity is even more important. And when beliefs have to be challenged, that's a little scary for people. So I think the only way you get over that is making the change so exciting, so aspirational that people feel that I have agency. I'm choosing to do something differently, right? I'm not going to have a lecture about what I consume. Oh, but you know what? Actually, that recyclable shopping bag is beautiful. This is cool. I don't mind carrying this around. So I think you have to synthesize a lot of contradictory information in interesting ways. And you see that again, having a collective story, like in India with the sanitation campaign, you have this Bollywood movie, Toilet Ek Prem Katha. I mean, so you give that narrative to a lot of people at the same time, and very quickly you're able to drive change on an issue that has, not really moved in years, yet they were able to very quickly get a lot of people on board. And I think that understanding what the hesitation is very deeply and still also providing something that is aspirational, that does not feel forced, where you're still respecting people's beliefs, but helping them to take a step forward is super important. And once that's done, then a lot of the other things we do strategically and in other markets suddenly open up, and that market becomes much larger.
Deepa, you stress the importance of leadership and values in your book. How can business leaders foster an environment that empowers their teams to think creatively and develop products that deeply connect with consumers?
Yeah, I think that, we'd really tried to propose one way of doing it, but I think the fundamentals are really a deep commitment to learning and inclusion. Those are the non-negotiables because I think everyone looks at the results from firms like Apple or whatever else and says, oh my God, how would I ever replicate that? But if you look at really even firms that are considered design driven, what they're able to do is capture outsized gains from pretty attainable behaviors, like really observing customers, talking to people, really having kind of in-depth immersive environments and having a way to process feedback. So I think that commitment to learning has to be there. And also investing in a common language. I can't emphasize this strongly enough because I think a lot of the missteps we talked about also a result of this. What really happens is that, inside companies, there are a lot of people who are trained on the spreadsheet and fewer are trained on the sketch, right? But in the end of the day, my sketch and your spreadsheet are really two visions of the future. but how do I make the tie break, right? That's not clear. So whatever system you use, that common language needs to be there because there will always be inevitable trade-offs in implementation when you're taking things to market. Something has to be adapted. So if you can understand what aspects of your design people are responding to, what are the core things that really create the experience, you can safely make changes to it, right? I mean, if your supply chain has an issue, if consumer preferences have changed, if there's a tariff, whatever the case may be, you can suddenly understand, like, well, I don't want to cut an artery to save cost. I can trim a toenail and I can do these little tweaks that still give me the experience without, detracting too much from what people have built their trust and relationship with. So that's where I think that basic understanding that I am fundamentally trying to help people lead a better life. The way I do it is going to be different based on my industry. But this invitation to conversation and feedback from all sides is critical.
What are some areas where design can have greatest impact?
This is the counterintuitive finding that Deepak is that, people have always traditionally thought about design in fashion and art and kind of the traditional like outer packaging type of areas. But where design really has, I think, the greatest impact that we've seen is in healthcare and in financial services. And let me explain why. Those are the areas where people have maximum anxiety, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I trust myself to pick out a handbag or a perfume. And of course, I'm influenced by celebrity endorsements and all this other good stuff. But that doesn't have like really long-term consequences, and maybe on my bank account. But other than that, I'm good. But financial services and healthcare are so fundamental to our sense of security. Those have a lot of anxiety, and a lot of us are not necessarily trained to process all the information that we get from those sources. So if you can create comfort level, if you can design the medicine so that compliance becomes easier, if I can coat the pill so that it's a little easier to swallow, making me more likely to swallow it, those are areas where there are huge outsized gains, right? If I can understand how I need to budget my money a little bit better, I'm able to achieve goals that seemed unattainable, at one time. So those are areas where I think we've really seen and observed huge, huge gains from companies and even startups that do these things well. And I think now another area that I think will explode in the future is in the area of, governance, because there's a lot of conscious effort on policy design in various countries as innovation stakes get higher. Um, and I think we'll see a lot of integration of design thinking into policies to address basically inequality, provision of public services, how we construct even just, policies around work and everything, which all have to change because of COVID. Now that we're still feeling the after effects of that. How work is done, how benefits are distributed to who. All of these things are really going to be very interesting areas where I think design will have a huge impact. Um, and education as well. I mean, I think if you really look now at the cost of education and the benefits that it offers and the longevity of those benefits, right? I mean, before, if you went to a great institution, you were set up for life. Now that's no longer the case. So how do you design education into bite-sized pieces to keep people continuously updated and able to develop and deploy skills? That's going to be a huge challenge in the coming years. And I think that, again, design is a fundamental piece of keeping people engaged, and able to move forward and accept change.
Deepa, my last question. For executives looking to implement the ideas in predictable magic within their organizations, what are the first steps they should take to align corporate strategy and design thinking?
Yeah, I think the number one thing you need to do is really take very close stock of what the goals are, right? I mean, I think and the understanding has to be very clear that whatever strategic challenges any company is facing today, design is deeply embedded in the approach that you ultimately have to take, whether it's globalization, responding to competitors, whatever the case may be. All of those things require you to do something differently and to show and share with people what you've done. Right. So I think one of my favorite quotes about design is I said, design is the formal answer to a strategic question. So you really have to be able to communicate. Design is really a means of communicating what you've done. And I think what has changed a lot in the last decade or so is really there was always the sense like, well, design is very risky, right? I mean, that's at the end of my process. And well, then I'm going to trust the branding and advertising people to help me tell the story. And I think what's shifted now is people are looking at design even to frame the question. That is a huge change, right? It used to be that, well, this is like a polishing process. That's not really the case. It's like, well, I mean, let me understand what are the challenges for consumers? Like, even that is kind of a design process of discovery. What is the approach that's going to make a difference? What's missing? Why can certain people not access what's already out there? So I think that understanding that design is going to be there and what tools and like what are just the missing pieces in the communication, right? And I think that that common language again, is design is really a process as a company of taking an idea from something only you see to suddenly taking it to something everyone can see and can share and can benefit from. So that deep commitment again to consumers and to whatever societal goals, in many cases now that companies are called upon to do, is a great starting point. And again, the main thing is to have a process to continue the conversation because there's so much data that you get inundated with when you're creating, but then the data that comes in and the feedback that comes in is an avalanche as well. So if you succeed, it's amazing how much information gets put at you, which can really help you inform what to do next if you know how to capture it. So I think that's the really exciting part, but that deep commitment to learning is important. And I think making the process fun, right? At some point, it's a lot of work. So the more you can do to make it feel like a field trip rather than an all-nighter, the better. I think, and people are usually the gap. Ultimately, feeling that you've made a difference and that people understood what you were trying to create and benefited from it is a wonderful payoff. And there's huge economic benefits to getting this right. Emotional connection is one of the only sources of advantage that grows over time. So worth your investment.
Yeah. Listeners, as we come to the end of today's episode, I want to express my sincere gratitude to Deepa Prahalad for joining us. Her wealth of experience, her passion for design thinking, and her deep insights into the intersection of innovation and business strategy have made this conversation truly enriching. Deepa's work continues to inspire and guide organizations toward making a meaningful impact, and we are fortunate to have had the opportunity to hear from today. Thank you, Deepa, for sharing your expertise and for being such an advocate for the transformative power of design and creativity in business. It has been a truly honor to having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa. It was a pleasure to be here.